One of the payoffs at times from this learning process is not only engagement at the cluster level, but also engagement business to business. And as you were talking, for example, about your science park, and as you were talking about in Greece, how you are deliberately co-locating related firms in the same building. I guess in part to build trust, but also, and would welcome you exploring this a little bit, perhaps to build these business to business links, perhaps business to business links even amongst competitors. Is that happening?
The reason, for example, in our case, is to have unintentional spillovers so that the best and bad practices are spread among the members in a way that they really don't understand, but they move all together into the right direction.
We also look at some kinds of business-to-business relations within the field of renewable. We saw how this was done in San Francisco last year, and we're looking at how could we do this also in the Oslo region. So, and we have done that in another context. I think it's rather interesting because you manage to achieve many things at different levels at the same time, because every company asks themselves, what's in it for me? And you have every day to focus on what you do as a cluster manager. This is for the best of the company, for the development of the companies in your region.
Yeah, and I will also agree here that the companies want to see increase in sales, and if they see the smell of money, they are interested in being part of the common work.
Thank you very much. So now let us turn to the important issue of governance and financing. I mean, you have seen many of these cluster initiatives and cluster organizations around the world. How are they financed and how do they govern these initiatives?
Important question, and this is one key area where often clustering initiatives lose their way. A clustering initiative is usually started with funding from a public agency. Sometimes it's a national government agency, sometimes it's the World Bank, it's US aid or an NGO. So some form of public funds to help to mobilize, to kickstart. But it is important over time that the financing and indeed the governance shifts from that initiating agency, particularly to the local actors. I'd like to highlight here three key points. So emphasizing over time this change, emphasizing the importance of triple helix alignment. By this I mean government, business, academia able to row in the same boat together. So senior folks, such as the rector from the university, maybe it's the mayor or the governor representing government, senior business leaders. But over time, the leadership of this clustering initiative moving particularly to the private sector. I sense there is a risk when a clustering initiative somehow stays owned by the public sector. There's a risk that businesses see it as, well, it's theirs rather than ours. So encourage here, as part of the evolution of the governance, for ownership particularly to move to the private sector. But the public sector, academia, is still there around that senior table. They're not walking away. Important here to have leaders who understand what are the key issues, but also have a passion to engage. So they're not coming to this high table to develop the agenda for their organization, but rather do have this wider perspective. Important too in the longer term to have a multiplicity of sources for funding, partly to ensure that no one agency, no one funder is able to dominate the development agenda for that cluster, but rather a multiplicity of sources, so the agenda that comes through is truly owned by the actors in the region, rather than being imposed on them by outsiders.
Okay. So now let's turn to the important role of the cluster manager, or sometimes called the cluster facilitator. I remember before when we talked about this some time ago, you made a clear distinction between a manager and a facilitator. And to some extent, I remember you talked about it's not like running a firm like a CEO. It is not about building a strategic plan, for example. It's more like building a strategic agenda. You develop and you bring in resources and you create something out of the mix of actors. So
And the word,
Let's hear about
the word
that.
cluster manager certainly is used quite common, particularly in Europe. But in other parts of the world, even in Scandinavia, I see the term facilitator or process leader being used. And I much prefer that, because as you're saying, this is not a management role in a traditional sense. In a sense, the person in this role has no ability to tell people, to instruct people, but rather does have the ability to empower, to engage them, to support the agenda.
Okay.
And I prefer, too, to see a clustering initiative that thinks not so much about having a strategic plan, where perhaps the finances are neatly matched by the projects, but rather in a bolder sense, a strategic initiative that has a strategic agenda. A strategic agenda where perhaps at one point in time they don't know where the resources are going to come, but they are setting a challenge, a high challenge.
Okay, so let us listen to the three voices again from the North Mid Sweden region, the three cluster managers or process leaders.
It's a challenging work, you know. It's like being an artist, a politician and a CEO at the same time. You have to perform on stage every day for the cluster and the investors in the cluster. But you also have to be a politician and create and sell the vision about the future for the cluster and the industry as such. And then you have to be the CEO or the engine of the network to build trust between the different partners of the network, but also create value for the actors in the network. And you have to inspire people to work within the network to build up the cluster organization as such. And it's those cluster heroes, the cluster champions, that you have to find and facilitate, because they are the ones that building the brand for the cluster over time, but also enabling the long-time financing. It takes time for a cluster to grow to that level where you can actually start working with innovation and get the players out on an international stage.
It is very important for the cluster manager to understand the importance of strategic work, and at the same time it's extremely important to be receptive to changes in the world.
To be successful in cluster development, a lot of people talk about connecting companies and connecting companies with the academia and the government, but I don't believe in that at all, because I know that to be successful in developing our clusters is about connecting people, to build trust and to get people being comfortable in their different roles and to force them to work together with each other, even if they are competitors in different companies.
Let me lift up in a helicopter over what we've just heard. And I want to share with you some of the key elements that I've seen from maybe 3,000 cluster facilitators that I've worked with around the world. This person, firstly, is a change agent. Public funding is not coming in to maintain the status quo, it is coming in to change. This person needs to be an initiator. This person needs to be able to create this open, a learning environment, moving from silos into a more integrated system. So describing this person as a boundary crosser, as we've just been hearing, a boundary crosser between firms and universities, between government agencies. And often I see a clutter of government agencies trying to work in an uncoordinated way to move a cluster forward rather than alignment between them. So needs the facilitator as a boundary crosser. A person who is very well connected within the cluster, very well connected with the key stakeholders, the key actors, but also well connected beyond the cluster, well connected with the other clusters in the region as part of the regional innovation system, but also well connected, for example, with related clusters further afield. And particularly thinking here of an environment that can help to build business-to-business links between related clusters internationally.